Everyone, and welcome to virtual class today, or what have you. So today, I'm not going to kind of talk about this for too long. Not to say it's not important, very far from that. But today, we're going to talk about, as you could imagine, one of the kind of most shameful and unfortunate, really, segments of American history. A segment that, in many ways, is still not fully ended. That we're still living with the legacies of, and that involves slavery. Okay, so for all the great stuff that we've talked about already, how colonies like Jamestown went from rags to riches, and all these kind of great things are happening, and all the colonies are getting all their own ideals and identities. In the background of all that, slaves are being introduced into the colonies, right? And again, like I said, we're still living in a lot of ways with the legacies of slavery. And we're going to be talking about slavery, as you can imagine, for the rest of this class in various forms here and there. Okay, which again, slavery is going to eventually lead us to the Civil War. So, really, in America's origin story, even relatively quickly, slavery is going to become a part of that. And it's something that we all still need to kind of grapple with and wrestle with. Okay, so first of all, how did kind of African slaves begin arriving to the English colonies? Well, many were bought and sold by Europeans from West African tribes. So Spain was kind of doing some forms of slavery. They were mostly enslaving the Native Americans. Encomienda, that whole system. The encomienda system was a version of that. Okay. France had something in the way of slavery, but they, especially kind of in Haiti and some of their kind of Caribbean colonies, the English, like kind of the other European nations, are buying a lot of their slaves from West African tribes. And so that's something important to remember, that they're not necessarily going in there invading West Africa, stealing people, and then taking them over to the New World. Oftentimes, those West African tribes, Africans in their own right, are kind of selling off political prisoners or people that were in their own jails, selling them over to England or some of the other colonies. So again, that's important to remember here, is that early on, kind of the West Africans themselves were handing over some of their own brothers or sisters. Okay. Again, many of them, as they're kind of getting on the ships, they're being branded and crammed into these ships. Very minimal food and drink. And pretty cruelly, those who died or were sick were simply just thrown overboard, right? That they really didn't kind of have any systems to take care of these slaves from transporting them. So it was all about trying to keep them as healthy as possible. But again, they're cramming them into these ships, and I'll show you a picture of how tight these ships were. As it goes without saying, a pretty miserable experience. Okay, so as I said, those who died or were sick were unfortunately threw overboard. Now, the Middle Passage, that's going to be an important name for you to remember. That's going to be the name of the route, right? So West Africa is where they started. These West African slaves took that Middle Passage and arrived into the New World. Okay. Again, some were sent to kind of the Caribbean, but the grand majority of the English slaves are going to be sent to kind of the eastern seaboard of what will become the United States. Okay. And between 1450 in 1870. So that's a long period of time, about 400 years. Between 10 to 12 million enslaved Africans are going to be sent to the Americas, and that's not counting the actual populations of them when they get there, right? Because they're going to arrive there, and over time are going to be bred and kind of bred and raised in that system. That's just those who were brought over. Okay, so between 1450 and 1870, between 10 to 12 million enslaved. And if it was one single slave, obviously that would be far too many, right? But we're talking about 10 to 12 million. Pretty shameful stuff. Okay, again, we'll kind of go along with that shame. These are what these ships look like, kind of the bottom of the ships. You can see they're just kind of individually, they were packing in as many of these West African slaves as they could. Okay, so again, pretty horrible conditions. So once they arrived to the colonies, what's happening? Well, again, the very first kind of West African slaves are going to arrive in Virginia, in Jamestown, in 1619. And you may have heard a little bit last year, in 2019, of the 400-year anniversary of the first slaves arriving to the New World, or Jamestown, or what's going to become naturally America. Okay. Now, English law did not initially recognize chattel slavery. And what is chattel slavery? It's essentially the actual ownership of one human being over another. Now, I'm going to talk about the difference between that and indentured servitude because while that could be tough, wasn't nearly as bad as chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is saying, I literally own this other human being. I literally own this. I can put them in my pocket. I can do what I want to with them. Okay, so that chattel slavery, again, that actual ownership of one human being over another. Now, again, England initially didn't really have that even over in England. They weren't really a fan of that. And so at first, it's not going to be recognized, okay? And slavery is going to slowly develop throughout the Chesapeake colonies. So those early colonies, Virginia, Maryland, develops relatively slow, isn't going to kind of boom at first, okay? And at first, a lot of those slaves who arrived in Jamestown or in Virginia or in Maryland are treated like indentured servants. And what indentured servants essentially were, think of them almost as a cross between those debtors that I talked about when I was talking about Georgia and people looking to kind of dig themselves out of a hole. Okay, so they were indentured servants, sometimes black, but even most indentured servants were white. And what that meant was maybe they had some jail time or they had something that they were kind of fighting up against. They could work for so many years and eventually gain their freedom. Okay, so that is going to be early on what slaves are going to be treated like. Okay, so at first, it's not going to be as harsh. Again, it's still not great circumstances, but at first, a little easier on them, okay? And at first, also, children born to African slaves, right? So say somebody was born in West Africa, they were brought over in a slave ship. They come over here and had a child, man or woman, that child would not necessarily be considered a slave at first, okay? They were born free, and so they weren't necessarily tied to their parents' status as slaves, okay? And another big thing is some early slaves could obtain their freedom if they converted to Christianity. Now, naturally, many of the slaves arriving are not Christian. They have their own kind of languages certainly, but religions and tribal customs and traditions. And many of these slaves, you also got to remember, are not necessarily of the same culture. They're just kind of throwing all these slaves, Africans, together and assuming, hey, you all speak the same language, you all have the same cultures. Similar to what we're talking about with the monoculture of Native Americans, many of these Africans thrown together don't speak the same language, don't necessarily have the same cultural traits or the same cultural values or the same religions. But over time, those differences are going to be smoothed away when they're all considered just all, quote, African, and they realize they have to stick together because all of the kind of white settlers are deeming them and kind of looking at them all the same way. So some of them are offered, hey, if you convert to Christianity, that is going to maybe be a path for kind of easing your fate a little bit, okay? But things are going to start to get worse, okay? Because in Virginia, as tobacco's kind of growing, and as Virginia and Jamestown colonies are kind of booming and getting better for the white settlers, more demand necessarily you have for labor. So as we need more people to work the land, more and more slaves are going to start to arrive. And as a result, their status is going to unfortunately change, okay, to get much harsher than it already was. Slave codes are going to start to be introduced. And what are slave codes? Essentially, they're a set of laws defining the relationship between the enslaved and free peoples, right? So what are these slave codes basically doing? They're basically saying you can't own property, so you can't own any land or a home or really anything. You can't testify against whites in court. So you could have seen a white person kind of full blatantly commit a crime. You could not testify against them in court. They could basically walk away scot-free if they had done something and an African slave had seen them. Okay. They also couldn't move about and assemble in large numbers freely. Now I'm going to talk about a notable exception to that here in a little bit. But again, for the most part, they couldn't come together. They couldn't form any sort of political groups, couldn't form any kind of groups, even social groups sometimes, just to kind of talk and commune and recreate with one another. Even that was a huge problem, okay? And so by the early 1700s, once the colonies have really been firmly established, kind of slavery is going to become a generally accepted aspect of colonial society, right? So at first it was a bit of a novelty, really only going on in maybe Virginia and Jamestown and Maryland. But over time, as the years pass and we're getting to the early 1700s, slavery is going to become a very accepted aspect, unfortunately, of colonial society. So as you can see, if you were a slave, you had practically no rights, right? These slave codes were saying, no, you're a second class or third class citizen. you're a piece of property. We do not deem you as worthy of being a person who is an individual who matters, who has rights. Okay, so that's again important to remember. So, what is this new status quo? Well, by 1775, so years are going to go by, and right before the American Revolution is going to take place, and later on, I'll actually talk about what role slaves played in the American Revolution. Okay, because they do play a big one. Okay. By 1775, about 20%, 1 in 5 of that colonial population is of an African heritage. Okay, so 1 in 5 of all the population in those English colonies that are getting ready to kind of declare their independence from Britain is African heritage, right? So that 20%, that's 1 in 5. That's comparable to what the African American population is now, and again shows that hey, they are a big part of American society, whether we kind of want to admit they are or not. Okay, so white society was kind of turning a blind eye to slavery, not making it a big deal. There are going to be some early abolitionists, but that's incredibly the minority. It's going to take kind of another 100 years for the abolition movement to really take hold. Okay, so about 1 in 5, again, of that colonial population is African. Okay, and you can imagine probably this: no group in American society during this time endures lower status or hardship. Now, you might be thinking, what about the Native Americans, right? Native Americans, while they themselves are being persecuted and fought against by the white settlers, the colonials, still have something in the form of a community, right? They could still kind of commune on their own land or in their own space, and in some ways organize resistance against the white colonists or the white settlers. That is not really happening for African slaves, okay? So again, southern plantations, as you could imagine, are the harshest. Okay, as you go further north, slavery is a little bit, I don't want to use the term easier because it's not easy, but lighter, I guess we could say. It's still not great, but it's lighter in the kind of more New England and northern territories. But as you move further south into the Carolinas, into Georgia, okay, and Virginia, slavery is going to be harsher. Okay, long days, beaten, branded, and we'll talk more and more later about kind of daily lives of slaves, which are, of course, unfortunate. And oftentimes, very tragically, families are separated and bought and sold and just kind of thrown all over the place, right? So pretty harsh, cruel stuff. However, one small refuge for slaves and for Africans in America is going to be the church, family, and religion, right? So those who weren't broken away from their families came together through church. And again, church is going to be one thing that their white masters allow them to have, right? Because they say, we're going to let them have church. We're going to let them kind of commune with God. Now, this might sound benevolent, right? They're like, oh, they're looking out for them in some way. We need to give them something to kind of offer some sort of a peace or tranquility in their lives. So in some ways, it served as that. But also religion served as a way to kind of suppress everybody, to kind of calm them down, to not think about rebelling or think about acting out, or again, think about trying to declare their own independence, right? So in some ways, again, it's to kind of saying, well, we'll give them this as a way to commune and kind of be with one another. But at the same time, they're using it to suppress them and using it to say, hey, you have your churches and religion, which is saying we need to be kind of be at peace and at one with God, as a way to tamp down on, again, maybe the desires for freedom or the desires to break away from a kind of a slavery society. So last slide here. This is actually going to be an instance of a slave rebellion, and there will be later slave rebellions once the United States becomes the United States proper. Okay. A group of slaves in kind of the Stono River region of South Carolina are going to rebel against their white owners and try to escape to Spanish Florida. So they say, listen, South Carolina, we got to pass through Georgia, but if we get through Georgia and make it to Spanish Florida, maybe the Spanish aren't going to be as harsh on us as these kind of English kind of settlers or colonials are. Maybe that can be something to kind of we can break away from and start a new little society down there. Okay. Unfortunately for them, a militia is going to kind of be raised in South Carolina and hunt down these people who had organized and kind of carried out this rebellion. And 44 of these African Americans are going to be killed, as well as 21 whites in the process. Okay. And this kind of serves as kind of a two-pronged thing for white settlers. one thing, it sets an example. Hey, anybody who wants to try to run away or be a rebel or break away from slavery, hey, guess what? We're going to hunt you down and we're going to kill you. We're going to execute you. Okay, so in some ways, this increased the fear of slaves. If we act out, this could happen to us. But at the same time, it raises the fear of white colonists, right? Especially in those southern plantation regions. Slaves are not happy, and in some cases, they're willing to fight back and rebel. And again, there's going to be some later rebellions we'll talk about later before the Civil War. So again, this is going to raise the temperature a little bit in those slave territories, right? That, these slaves are not necessarily going to be happy with each and everything we give them, that in some cases they're willing to fight back and cause a rebellion. Okay, so again, I know this isn't fun stuff. It's tragic stuff, and we're kind of glossing over some of it. But again, that's something that we need to really remember and recall as Americans. If we're going to have pride in our country, which I certainly have a lot of myself, we got to admit these past mistakes, right? And the legacies that in many ways we're still unfortunately living with. If we can't really admit that, how can we be proud of America, both in the past, in the present, and in the future? Okay, so that's it for today. Be sure to, again, make sure you're answering all the questions. And if you have any questions for me, please ask, and I'll answer those. So take care.